The rope around her wrists was not the part that hurt, it was the silence. Lady Isolde Verren stood on a platform of black stone in the middle of the Orlane capital, snow falling into her hair like ash, and not one voice rose to stop what was about to happen. 5,000 people had come to watch the Empire's most beloved noblewoman die, for a crime she had not committed. Somewhere in that crowd was the prince who had once sworn, with his hand pressed flat against his chest, that he would burn the world down before he let harm touch her. He did not look away. He did not look at her at all. Somewhere in that crowd, too, was the knight who had guarded her door every night for 6 years, who had once carried her 3 miles through a blizzard rather than let her walk on a broken ankle. When the executioner asked if anyone would speak for the accused, Captain Cale Draven's jaw tightened and he said nothing. The headsman raised the blade. Isolde closed her eyes and thought, with a calm that frightened her more than the axe did, I would do it all again. I would still love these people who let me die. Then the world went white and cold, and she was 17 years old again, 5 years and 1 betrayal away from this exact moment. And this time she intended to make sure it never happened at all. 6 days before her 22nd birthday, Lady Isolde Verren learned the precise weight of betrayal. It weighed exactly as much as a folded letter, sealed in wax the color of dried blood, placed into a magistrate's hand by a woman who had once called her sister. The letter said Isolde had opened the sluice gates beneath the lower city on the night of the Ashfall Blight. It said she had done it in a fit of jealous rage after learning the crown would pass to a cousin instead of to her future husband, Crown Prince Cassian. It said 3,041 names, men, women, children who drowned in blighted water that turned their lungs to black lace within an hour were her doing. It was, in every particular, a lie. But it was a beautifully constructed lie, stitched from real ink, a real seal she had once used as a girl of 12 to sign love notes she never sent, and the real devastating fact that on the night of the disaster Isolde had been alone. No witnesses, no alibi. Only the truth, which by then had become the least useful thing in the entire empire. She remembered standing in the dock in a gown the color of mourning that someone else had chosen for her, watching the faces of people she had grown up beside. Duke Halstead, her adoptive father, sat with his hands folded and his eyes on the floor. Lady Rena Halstead, her step-cousin, her childhood shadow, the girl she had taught to braid her own hair when they were both 9, sat beside him with a black lace veil over a face that, Isolde would swear later, wore the faintest curve of a smile. Do you have anything to say in your defense? The magistrate had asked her. She had looked one last time toward the front row, toward Cassian, toward Cale. She had wanted more than she wanted to breathe for one of them to stand. Neither of them did. I have nothing, she said instead, because nothing I say will matter to people who have already decided what I am. They executed her 6 days later, on the morning of her 22nd birthday, in front of the same crowd that had once thrown white roses at her wedding carriage. And then, impossibly, mercifully, monstrously, she woke up. Not in the afterlife. Not in some soft, distant peace she might have earned. She woke in her childhood bed in the east wing of Halstead Manor, 16 years old turning 17 in a week, sunlight coming through a window. She remembered being bricked over during a renovation that hadn't happened yet. Her hands, when she raised them in front of her face, were unscarred. No rope burn, no chains, no 5 years of a court education in cruelty written into the calluses of her palms. On the writing desk beside her bed sat an invitation, ink still faintly wet, embossed with the crown seal of House Orlane. Lady Isolde Verren is cordially requested to attend the spring betrothal ball, where His Majesty will announce the intended of Crown Prince Cassian. She had received this exact invitation once before. She remembered opening it with trembling, delighted hands, remembered how her whole chest had filled with the particular golden hope of a girl who did not yet know that hope, in this palace, was simply grief that hadn't arrived yet. This time when she picked up the letter, her hand did not tremble. It went very, very still. I know how this story ends, she thought. I have already died wearing it. Downstairs, she could hear Rena's laughter drifting up through the stairwell, bright, easy, utterly untroubled by the 3,041 names that, in another turning of this same year, this same girl would help erase from the world and then pin on Isolde's grave. Isolde swung her legs out of bed and, for the first time in 5 years, for the first time really in her whole life, smiled without meaning a single soft thing by it. Rena, darling, she murmured to the empty room, testing the shape of the coming years on her tongue like a blade she was learning to hold. Let's see how well you dance when I'm the one leading. She did not yet know precisely how the blight had been made, or by whose hand the sluice gates had truly been opened, or why Cale Draven, steady, silent, devoted Cale, had said nothing while she died. She did not know yet whether Cassian's silence in that dock had been cowardice or something worse. 5 years of court had taught her many things too late. This time she promised the frost still clinging to the window glass she would learn them all in time. The trouble with knowing your own execution before it happens is that everyone around you is still living in the version of the story where it hasn't. Isolde came down to breakfast that morning to find Duke Halstead reading correspondence with his usual distracted courtesy and Rena, 17 radiant. Utterly unmarked by the woman she would one day become, chattering about ribbon colors for the ball as though ribbon colors were the most consequential thing in the empire. Isolde watched her adoptive father's face, searching it now with new and merciless eyes for the guilt she had somehow never noticed the first time. She found none. Whatever role Duke Halstead would play in the disaster to come, she was almost certain now, watching him butter his toast with the placid unconcern of a man who suspected nothing, that he did not yet know what his own daughter intended to become. "You're staring," Rena said, not unkindly tilting her head. "Is something wrong, Issy?" Issy, no one had called her that in 5 years. In the version of her life that had ended on a headsman's block, the last time Rena used that nickname had been the week before the betrothal ball, in this exact dining room, over this exact pot of chamomile tea. Isolde remembered it now with a clarity that made her chest ache, not because she had forgotten, but because she had spent 5 years training herself never to think of it at all. Since remembering the girl who called her Issy only made it harder to remember the woman who watched her die. "Nothing," Isolde said, and made herself smile the old, easy smile she used to wear before court taught her that smiles were currency and every currency could be counterfeited. "I was only thinking about the ball." She spent the rest of the week doing what 5 years of dying had taught her no noblewoman in the Orlane court ever thought to do. She watched, and she wrote things down, not letters. Not diaries anyone could steal and twist into evidence, as her own careless childhood correspondence had once been twisted. She kept everything in a private coded ledger disguised as an embroidery pattern book. A habit she'd learned from a cellmate in the 3 days between sentencing and execution. A debt-ridden merchant's widow who'd once run intelligence for a smuggling ring and had with nothing left to lose. Spent her final nights teaching Isolde the bones of tradecraft in exchange for the small mercy of someone to talk to. "Watch who enters a room before they speak," the widow had told her through the bars, her voice hoarse with the cold. The truth of a person is in what they do before anyone's looking. By the time they open their mouth, they've already decided what lie to tell you. So Isolde watched. She watched Lord Dorian Vask, the court's youngest master alchemist, linger 3 minutes too long near the treasury steward during a ball she barely remembered attending the first time around. His hands never quite still, his eyes cataloging exits the way a soldier's did. She watched Rena's maid slip out through the servants' passage twice in 1 week, carrying a satchel too heavy for laundry. She watched Prince Cassian, golden, easy, beloved Cassian, laugh at his father's jokes with a fraction of a second's delay, as though every reaction had to pass first through some anxious internal committee before it reached his face. She had loved him once. She still remembered the exact weight of that love, the way you remember a wound after the scar has healed over, distantly, almost fondly, but never without a flicker of the pain that made it. This time she watched him not as a girl in love watches the boy she adores, but as a woman who had died partly because of his silence watches a man she has not yet decided whether to forgive. On the 4th night, she found the first true thread. She had gone down to the manor's lower archive, a room Rena never visited since Rena had never once in either lifetime shown the faintest interest in the ledgers of House Halstead's water rights, looking for records of the old sluice system beneath the lower city. The same gates that would in 5 years be open to drown 3,041 people and end with Isolde's head on a block. She wanted to understand the mechanism before anyone had reason to use it. What she found instead, tucked behind a false panel that had clearly not been disturbed in years, was a contract. A commission dated only 8 months prior from an unnamed patron, addressed to a name she recognized instantly and with a jolt that went through her like cold water, Lord D. Vask, alchemical consultant. The commission was for a compound. The language was careful clinical. Dressed in the polite obscurity of court alchemy, a controlled agent for water purification testing discretion required. But Isolde had spent 5 years of her second life's worth of memory studying in the brief and terrible autopsy reports read aloud at her own trial. Exactly what the Ashfall blight had done to human lungs. She knew, reading this contract with her hands gone cold, that she was holding the seed of the exact poison that would one day be called her crime. She did not know yet who the unnamed patron was. She did not know whether Rena knew what slept behind that false panel in her own family's archive. She did not know, most dangerously of all, whether someone in this house already knew that she knew. Behind her, without warning, the archive door creaked open. Isolde, said a voice she had not expected, low, careful, entirely too familiar. What are you doing down here so late? She turned, contract still in hand, heart slamming against her ribs, to find Captain Cale Draven standing in the doorway with a lantern raised and an expression she could not yet read. For one suspended, airless moment, Isolde stood in the lantern light with 5 years of another woman's death folded into the muscles of her hands, staring at the one man whose silence in that other life had hurt her worse than the blade ever could. He looked younger here. Not just in years, though he was barely 21. Only newly appointed to the Halstead household guard rather than the decorated captain of the palace guard she had known, but younger in some quality she couldn't name until she realized what it was. He had not yet learned to make his face into a wall. In 5 years he would stand in a courtroom and watch her be sentenced to death without so much as a flicker crossing his features. Tonight, watching her clutch a stolen document in a dark archive at midnight, his face was almost comically easy to read, startled, wary, and underneath both unmistakably worried for her. I couldn't sleep, she said, which was true in a way that stretched across 5 years and 1 execution. I wanted to look through the old estate records. I didn't realize the hour. His eyes went inevitably to the paper still in her hand. That doesn't look like an estate record. He's observant, she thought, filing the fact away with the same cold precision the smuggler's widow had taught her. Good, I will need someone observant. She had 2 choices, she understood, standing there in the lamplight with her heart still hammering. She could lie to him, smoothly, completely, the way she had learned to lie to everyone in her second, wiser life. Because the version of herself who trusted too easily was the version who had died. Or she could do something far riskier. She could tell him a careful, incomplete truth and watch what he did with it. 5 years ago, no. 5 years from now, in a future she had unmade the moment she opened her eyes in this bed again, this man would stand silent while she was sentenced to die. She did not yet know why. She did not know if it was cowardice or coercion or something crueler still. But she remembered with a clarity that ached that in all the years before that courtroom, Cale Draven had never once lied to her. Not about anything, not even small things, not even when the truth cost him. Maybe she thought his silence in that courtroom wasn't betrayal. Maybe it was something done to him, not something he chose. It was a dangerous hope to hold on to. She held on to it anyway, because 5 years of grief had taught her that hope, carefully tested and never blindly trusted, was not the same weakness that had gotten her killed. Blind trust had killed her. Testing people, watching what they did before they knew they were being watched, that was armor. I found something I don't understand, she said slowly, watching his face. A contract for an alchemical compound, hidden behind a false panel in my own family's archive. She held it out to him, watching his hands as he took it, watching his eyes move across the words. She watched his jaw tighten as he read. Watched the careful, unhurried way he turned the page over, checking the seal, the date, the signature, the exact instincts of a man trained to look for what a document wasn't saying as much as what it was. This is Vask's hand, he said finally, quiet. I'd know that seal anywhere. He supplied the physician's corps with fever tonics when I served on the northern border, but this isn't a fever tonic contract. He looked up at her, and something in his expression had gone very still, very serious. Isolde. Does anyone else know you found this? No. Then no one else can know, not your father, not Lady Renna, not anyone in this house until we understand what it's for. He said it with a certainty that surprised her, not the tone of a guard deferring to his charge, but the tone of a man who had already, in the space of 30 seconds, decided this was now his problem too. Why would you help me with this? She asked, testing him, needing to know. You barely know me. Something crossed his face, then quick, almost embarrassed, gone before she could fully read it. Because 6 months ago I watched 3 of my men die from a blighted well outside the capital that no one could explain, and command called it an accident and told me not to ask questions, he said. I've been asking questions ever since. Quietly. He held the contract back out to her, and for just a moment his fingers brushed hers. I think you may have just found the first real answer I've had in half a year. Isolde took the paper back. And felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. Not quite hope, not quite trust, but the first small, cautious loosening of a fist she had held clenched since the moment the headsman's blade had caught the morning light. Perhaps she allowed herself to think, just once, before she buried the thought again beneath 5 years of hard-won caution, I am not entirely alone in this life the second time. But the very next morning, everything she thought she understood about the shape of this conspiracy would be thrown into chaos. Because Lady Renna Halstead's sweet, laughing, ribbon-obsessed Renna would corner her in the garden with a question so precisely, chillingly specific that Isolde would understand with her blood. running suddenly cold. That she was not the only person in Halstead Manor who remembered things that had not happened yet. "Issy," Rena would say, twirling a hair ribbon around one finger with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "you've been awfully interested in the old archive lately. Almost as if you're looking for something. A pause, sweet and terrible, or someone told you where to look." Isolde did not answer Rena in the garden that morning. She had learned, in 5 years of dying slowly under the weight of other people's assumptions, that the fastest way to lose a game was to let your opponent see how much a single question had rattled you. So she laughed, a light, careless laugh she had practiced 1,000 times in front of a mirror in a cell she no longer occupied, and said, "Looking for the good sherry father hides from the steward, actually. You've caught me red-handed." And she watched, with the same cold attentiveness the smuggler's widow had taught her, exactly how quickly relief moved across Rena's face. Too quickly, Isolde thought. A girl with nothing to hide doesn't need to be relieved. That night she did not sleep. She sat instead with her coded ledger open on her lap, writing down everything she remembered about the 5 years that had led to her death, everything she had learned in a single week of watching this house with new eyes, and trying to fit the pieces together like a puzzle whose final picture she had already seen once from the wrong side. She remembered the trial testimony now with a scholar's discipline instead of a victim's grief. The magistrate had said the sluice gates beneath the lower city, an old flood control system built 2 centuries ago and rarely used, had been opened deliberately on the night of the Ashfall Blight, releasing water contaminated with an alchemical agent that turned to poison gas on contact with air. The water itself had come from a reservoir that fed both the lower city's wells and, upstream, the irrigation channels of House Halstead's own estate lands. House Halstead's lands. She had never once, in 5 years of grief, questioned why the poisoned water had originated so close to her own family's holdings. She had been too busy being told, and eventually believing on some exhausted level, that the fault was entirely her own. It wasn't her own. It never had been. But someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure the water trail led back toward House Halstead, close enough to implicate the family, but with just enough distance and just enough forged evidence to let every finger point specifically and only at her. Someone wanted me blamed, not Rena, not my father, me specifically. The question hollowed out a cold, careful space inside her chest, because the answer, once she let herself consider it honestly, was smaller and more painful than any grand political conspiracy. Political conspiracies did not usually bother to be personal. This one had been built brick by careful brick around her. She thought of Rena's garden question again, or someone told you where to look, not a guilty question, a frightened one. The realization arrived slowly, the way cold water rises around your ankles before you notice you're standing in a flood. Rena was not the architect of this. Rena Isolde now suspected with a certainty that made her hands unsteady. Was afraid enough to test whether Isolde already knew something, afraid enough that her first instinct upon seeing Isolde near that archive had not been suspicion of a rival, but panic of a girl standing too close to something dangerous. If Rena isn't the mastermind, Isolde thought, staring at her own handwriting until the letters blurred, then in my first life, I spent my last 5 years hating the wrong person. It should have felt like relief. It felt instead like grief arriving late to its own funeral. Because if Rena hadn't orchestrated her death, then someone else had used Rena too, had perhaps threatened her into silence, the same way Isolde was beginning to suspect someone had threatened Kale. And Isolde had gone to her death never once understanding who had actually taken everything from her. She met Kale again 3 nights later, in the same archive, this time by careful arrangement rather than accident. He came with a folded paper of his own, a requisition record he'd quietly pulled from the palace garrison stores, showing an unusually large shipment of purification chalk, delivered to the lower city reservoir 6 weeks earlier, signed for not by any reservoir official, but by a name neither of them recognized, a steward listed only as T. Marrow on behalf of the Crown Treasury. There's no T. Marrow in the Treasury's records, Kale said, low, watching the door as he spoke. I checked. Whoever signed for that shipment used a false name to move something into the water supply that has no business being called purification chalk. 6 weeks ago, Isolde said slowly, doing the count in her head, the calendar of her own death rearranging itself before her eyes. The Ashfall Blight happens in 5 years, Kale, not 5 weeks. He went very still. You said happens, not might happen. She had not meant to say it. 5 years of careful lying, and the one truth that mattered most had slipped free simply because she was tired and frightened, and sitting across from the one person in either of her lives who had never once caught her in a falsehood. She looked up at him, at the lantern light catching the wary intelligence in his eyes, and made a decision she would spend the rest of the story either blessing or regretting. Because it already did, she said quietly. I've lived this year before, Kale. I died at the end of it, executed for a crime I never committed, for a disaster that poisoned 3,041 people in the lower city, using water drawn from a reservoir that someone is already, right now, 6 years too early, beginning to poison. Her voice did not shake, though her hands folded tightly in her lap did. I don't know how I came back. I only know I intend to make sure none of it happens again, and I need to know if you'll help me, or if you'll think I've gone mad and report me to my father in the morning. The silence that followed was the longest of her second life. Then Kale Draven set down the false requisition paper, met her eyes without flinching, and said the words that would anchor everything that came after. Tell me everything, from the beginning, I believe you. Outside the archive window. Unseen by either of them, a shadow that had been listening at the garden hedge for the better part of 10 minutes finally pulled back into the dark, and hurried silent and swift toward the servants' passage that led directly to Lady Rena Halstead's private chambers. Rena Halstead had not slept properly in 4 days, and it was beginning to show in the fine, papery shadows under her eyes that no amount of powder could fully hide. She sat now at her writing desk with a letter half finished in front of her, the ink drying unevenly because her hand kept stopping mid-sentence. Cousin, it began, not Issy, not the childhood nickname she'd used without thinking in the garden 3 days ago and regretted the instant it left her mouth, because using it now in the middle of everything felt like a lie dressed up as affection. Cousin, I do not know how much you have discovered, but I beg you to stop looking before it costs you more than you understand. She never finished it. She never sent it. Instead, close to midnight, her lady's maid, the same maid Isolde had noted slipping out through the servants' passage with an overweight satchel, returned breathless from the garden hedge and relayed, word for word, everything she had overheard. Isolde knew about the reservoir. Isolde knew about Vask's compound. Isolde had said the words "I've lived this year before" to a household guard captain, and had not been laughed at for it. Rena sat very still after the maid finished speaking, staring at the unfinished letter until the ink had fully dried into something she could no longer send even if she'd wanted to. Here was the truth that Isolde, in either of her lives, had never once been given the chance to learn. Rena Halstead was not a villain. She was a frightened 19-year-old girl who, 8 months prior, had made one catastrophic mistake out of jealousy and desperation, and had spent every day since trying and failing to find a way to undo it before it swallowed everyone she loved. It had started small, the way these things always do. Rena had loved Cashin first, quietly, hopelessly, for 3 years before his betrothal to Isolde was ever announced. A love she had never spoken aloud to anyone because Isolde was her cousin, her sister in every way that mattered, and some loyalties felt more sacred than desire. When the betrothal was announced, something in Rena had cracked in a way she was too proud and too ashamed to name even to herself. Lord Dorian Vask had found her in that cracked place with the precision of a man who made a career of finding exactly such places in exactly such people. He had approached her not with threats, but with sympathy, with careful, patient conversations about how unfair it was that the crown had already decided her fate before she'd had any say in her own life, about how a woman with the right information at the right moment might yet reshape her future. He had never once in those early conversations mentioned poison or the reservoir or 3,041 names that did not yet have faces. By the time Rena understood what she had actually agreed to, a single small act she'd been told. A delayed shipment intercepted and quietly redirected nothing that would hurt anyone only enough to embarrass the Crown Treasury's oversight of the lower city's infrastructure and force a public inquiry that might in its wreckage delay or derail the betrothal. It was already too late to refuse without Vask making good on the quiet, almost gentle threat he delivered the very first time she tried to back out. Your family's debts to the Treasury are more extensive than your father has told you. Lady Rena, it would be a shame if that became public before the wedding. She had told herself every single night since that it was only a delayed shipment. That it could not possibly become the thing Isolde had apparently just described in a darkened archive to a man Rena barely knew. 3,041, she thought now, staring at the drying ink of a letter she would never send. And for the first time allowed herself to fully imagine what delayed shipment might actually mean when the person orchestrating it was an alchemist with access to a reservoir feeding half the lower city's wells. She was still sitting there, frozen, when a soft knock came at her chamber door, 3 measured raps followed by a 4th, delivered with a patience that made her stomach drop before the door had even opened. Only one person in the manor knocked that way. Lady Rena, said Lord Dorian Vask, letting himself in without waiting for an answer, his voice as pleasant and unhurried as ever. I understand your dear cousin has taken an interest in reservoir maintenance. He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes any more than Rena's smiles ever had. I do hope you haven't been careless with our arrangement. It would be such a shame if I had to remind your father just how deep the Halstead debts truly run, or worse. To remind the Crown who first suggested the delay to the lower city's flood inspections 8 months ago. Rena's hands folded in her lap went white at the knuckles. I haven't told her anything. I know, Vask said, and the pleasantness in his voice did not waver even slightly as he crossed to stand beside her writing desk, glancing down at the unfinished letter with mild, unbothered interest. Which is precisely why I've decided the timeline needs to move sooner than we'd planned. Lady Isolde is proving rather more resourceful than either of us anticipated. He tucked the letter into his coat with 2 fingers, as casually as a man pocketing an unwanted receipt. I'll need you to arrange an outing to the lower city reservoir grounds next week, Lady Rena. A charitable visit, I think. The Halstead name does love its charity. Bring your cousin along. I find it's always safer to keep one's obstacles where one can see them. Rena stared up at him and understood with a clarity that arrived 5 years too late in one version of this story and perhaps just in time in another, exactly what kind of man she had allowed into her family's darkest debts. And if I refuse, she whispered. Vask's smile widened, gentle and terrible. Then I'm afraid your cousin won't be the only Halstead the Crown finds reason to try. 2 nights later, Isolde asked Cale the question she had been circling for a week. Ever since he had said, I believe you, and something in her chest had loosened for the first time in 5 years of grief. In the life I remember, she said carefully, watching the fire in the small guardhouse hearth rather than his face, because she was not certain she could bear to watch his expression change while she said it, you were there. At my trial. You stood in the front row of the gallery every single day, and when the magistrate asked if anyone would speak in my defense, you said nothing. She made herself look up. I need to understand why. Not because I don't trust the man sitting in front of me now, I do, more than I've trusted anyone in 5 years. But because I need to know what could silence you, so I can make certain it never has the chance to happen again. Cale was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a rawness to it she hadn't heard before, not even in the archive when he'd first agreed to help her. I don't know the answer you're looking for, he said. Because it hasn't happened yet in this version of things, but I can tell you what would silence me if someone wanted to try. He turned to face her fully, and his jaw was tight in a way that told her this cost him something to say aloud. My mother and younger sister live in a border garrison town that answers directly to the Crown Treasury's regional office. The same office, I'd wager, that T. Marrow used to move a false shipment past inspection. If someone with that kind of reach wanted my silence, they wouldn't need to threaten me at all. They'd only need to threaten them and let me work out the rest myself. Isolde felt something cold settle into her stomach. Not surprise exactly, but the terrible confirmation of a fear she'd carried since the moment she woke up in her 17-year-old body and realized betrayal rarely wears the face you expect it to. So in my first life, she said slowly, you didn't stay silent because you stopped caring what happened to me. You stayed silent because someone made staying silent the price of keeping your family alive. I don't know that for certain, Cale said. I can't know what I haven't lived. But if I had to guess at the shape of a threat cruel enough to make a man watch someone he stopped himself, color rising faintly at his throat, and started again with careful precision. Someone he respects be executed without a word in her defense, that's the only shape I can imagine fitting. Someone he respects. Isolde noted the words he'd chosen not to say, filed them away the way she filed every observation now. Without letting herself linger too long on what they might mean, because there would be time for that, after the Empire's greatest criminal had made certain she never became the Empire's greatest criminal at all. Then we protect your family, she said instead, practical, already turning the problem over the way she'd learned to turn every problem over in 5 years of a life that had taught her hope was only useful when it came with a plan attached. Quietly. Before anyone realizes we've thought of it. If Vask or whoever he answers to intends to use your family as leverage against you, I intend to make certain there's nothing left to leverage by the time they try. Cale looked at her for a long moment. Something unguarded moving behind his eyes that she recognized with a small ache as the particular disbelief of a man who had spent his whole life being the one who protected others, and had never quite learned what it felt like to be protected in return. Why would you spend your resources protecting my family, he asked quietly, when you're the one with a death sentence already written somewhere in this timeline's future? Isolde considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider everything now, and found the answer sitting closer to the surface than she expected. Because in my first life, I died believing almost everyone I loved had abandoned me, and it turned out at least one of them had simply been trapped, she said. I don't intend to make the same mistake twice, assuming the worst of people before I've bothered to ask what's actually keeping them silent. You asked questions when your men died of a blighted well and command told you not to. That's not the behavior of a man who abandons people easily, Kale. That's the behavior of a man who was made to choose between two people he couldn't bear to lose, and I refuse to let anyone put you in that position again. The fire popped softly in the grate. Outside, somewhere across the dark grounds of Halstead Manor, a lantern moved past a window that should have been dark at this hour. Renna's window, though neither of them was watching closely enough that night to notice. Or to wonder why Lady Renna Halstead was still awake, still pacing, still turning over an impossible ultimatum with no good ending in sight. There's something else, Kale said finally, breaking the quiet between them. I did some digging today into the Crown Treasury's regional postings. The garrison town where my family lives, its treasury office reports directly to a supervisor whose signature I recognized on an old requisition form. The same supervisor, he said, watching her face carefully as the pieces assembled themselves, who personally approved Lord Dorian Vask's appointment as court alchemist 4 years ago, on the recommendation of a mentor Vask has publicly credited in 3 separate guild addresses. Isolde felt the floor of her careful, patient investigation tilt beneath her. Who? Kale said the name, and for the first time since she had woken up 17 years old with 5 years of grief folded into her chest, Isolde understood that the conspiracy she was hunting did not end with a jealous cousin and an ambitious alchemist. It reached quietly and with terrible patience all the way to the throne room itself, and the man whose name Kale had just spoken was someone she had once, in another life, called by a title far more intimate than supervisor. The name Kale had spoken sat in Isolde's chest for 3 days like a stone she could not put down. Duke Aldrich Orlane, the king's younger brother, Lord Regent of the Crown Treasury. And in the life Isolde remembered, the man Cassian had always called Uncle Aldrich with the easy, unguarded affection of a boy who had lost his own mother young, and found something like a second father in his uncle's steady presence. She had called him Uncle too once in the brief golden months of her betrothal, before the world had taught her that titles of affection meant nothing at all. She did not go to Cassian immediately. 5 years of grief had taught her caution above all else, and caution said, confirm everything twice before you risk the one relationship that might unravel this conspiracy from the inside. But 4 days after Kale's revelation, Cassian himself found her in the palace gardens during a spring reception, golden and easy and so achingly familiar that for one unguarded moment, Isolde forgot every careful lesson she had built her second life around. You've been avoiding me, he said, not accusing, just observing the way he'd always had a habit of stating truths gently, as though truths were easier to bear when delivered without weight. I've been busy, she said, which was not a lie. And watched him accept it with the same easy trust he seemed to extend to nearly everyone. A trust that in her first life she had once found endearing, and now with 5 years of hindsight found almost unbearably dangerous in a man who would one day be emperor. My uncle mentioned you, Cassian said, and something in Isolde went very still. Said you've been asking unusual questions about the Treasury's reservoir maintenance budget. He seemed, Cassian paused, searching for the word, and something in his easy expression flickered just slightly into concern. He seemed more interested in it than I expected him to be, honestly. My uncle doesn't usually notice minor budget inquiries from the daughters of minor houses. No offense, he added quickly, catching himself. You know what I mean, he noticed. Isolde filed the detail away with cold precision even as her heart hammered. Aldrich had noticed her interest quickly enough to mention it to Cassian, which meant either he was testing whether Cassian would report back to her, or he genuinely didn't yet suspect how much she knew and was simply being thorough. Either way, the window for careful, quiet investigation had just narrowed considerably. Cassian, she said, and heard her own voice drop into a register she hadn't planned to use, quieter, more urgent. The voice of a woman who had once died partly because of this man's silence, and could not this time afford to let politeness cost her the chance to change that. If I told you I believed someone close to your family was planning something that would hurt thousands of people in the lower city, and that the evidence pointed toward your uncle, would you believe me, or would you protect him? The question landed between them like a dropped blade. Cassian's easy expression drained away, entirely replaced by something far more careful, far more guarded, and Isolde understood watching it happen. That she was seeing for the first time the face he must have worn in a courtroom 5 years from now, the face of a man caught between two loyalties he had never learned how to weigh against each other. "That's a serious accusation," he said slowly. "I know. Do you have proof?" "I have a contract for an alchemical compound capable of poisoning a water supply, hidden in my own family's archive. I have a falsified shipment record signed by a name that doesn't exist in the Treasury's rolls. I have a household guard captain whose family lives under the jurisdiction of a regional treasury office that answers directly to your uncle. And I have every reason to believe that same office is being used to threaten people into silence." Isolde kept her voice level, watching him absorb each piece, watching the particular anguish of a man realizing the ground beneath his family might not be solid at all. "I don't have proof that would satisfy a magistrate, Cashin, not yet. But I have enough that I would stake my life on it, and I intend to one way or another, because I refuse to watch thousands of people in the lower city die for a plot I could have stopped." Cashin was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Isolde began to fear she had misjudged everything. That the golden, gentle prince she remembered loving was underneath it all simply too loyal to family to ever choose against his uncle the way he had once in another life. Been too paralyzed by competing loyalties to speak a single word in her defense. Then he said quietly, "My uncle raised me after my mother died. He taught me to ride and to read a treaty, and he sat with me every night for a month after the fever that nearly killed me when I was 9. His voice caught just slightly. "I don't want to believe you. I want you to understand that clearly before I tell you what I'm about to tell you." He met her eyes. "But I also watched my uncle's face for 11 years, Isolde, and I have never once seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you a week ago when your name came up over dinner. He didn't look concerned for a foolish girl asking foolish questions. His jaw tightened, he looked afraid, and my uncle does not get afraid of anything." It was not the courtroom silence she remembered, it was not the abandonment she had spent 5 years grieving. It was something far more fragile and far more valuable, a man choosing in real time with visible cost to believe the woman in front of him over the family that had raised him. "What do you need from me?" Cashin asked. Isolde felt something in her chest crack open that she had kept sealed since the moment the headsman's blade caught the morning light. "Time," she said, "and access to the Treasury's regional postings without your uncle knowing you're looking." And she hesitated, then made herself say the rest. Because 5 years of dying had taught her that half-truths were how good people got killed by conspiracies they never saw fully. "I need you to understand that if the evidence proves what I believe it will, your uncle will not simply be removed from his post. He orchestrated the deaths of thousands of people to weaken your claim to the throne by destroying the woman you were meant to marry. If that's true, Cashin, there will be no version of this that doesn't end with you losing him entirely." Cashin's face in that moment held an expression Isolde would remember for the rest of whatever life she had left, grief arriving early. Grief for a loss that hadn't happened yet, grief for an uncle he still loved even as he began visibly to believe he might lose him to his own crimes. "Then let's find out together," he said, "before he decides you've become too dangerous to leave alive." He was right to worry. 3 streets away in a private study, lined with maps of the lower city's water systems, Duke Aldrich Orlain set down a letter from an informant in the Halstead household. The same maid who had once reported to Rena, now reporting for a price. To whoever paid the most for information about a certain overly curious young noblewoman, and allowed himself for the first time in 8 months of careful planning a small cold smile. "Move the timeline forward," he said to the shadow waiting by his study door. "The girl has apparently found a spine in this lifetime she didn't have before. We can't have that spreading." Isolde had exactly 9 days between the moment Cashin chose to believe her and the morning Rena arrived at her chamber door pale and shaking. To tell her that Duke Aldrich had personally requested, through Rena with a warmth that made her stomach turn, that Isolde join a charitable inspection of the lower city reservoir grounds the following week. "He's going to kill you there," Rena said, the words tumbling out in a rush. 5 years of silence and 8 months of terror finally breaking loose all at once. "I don't know exactly how, but I know it's not really about charity, and I know he's decided you've become a problem he can't leave unsolved. I should have told you weeks ago. I should have told you the moment you started asking questions in that archive instead of testing you in the garden like a coward." Her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry, Issy. I let a debt and a threat make me complicit in something I can't undo, and I don't know how to fix it, but I couldn't let you walk into that reservoir without at least trying." Isolde looked at her cousins, pale, shaking. Finally and fully honest for the first time in this entire ordeal. and felt the last of her old grief for Rena's supposed betrayal dissolve into something gentler and more complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding and the particular fierce protectiveness of a woman who had learned. Through 5 years of dying exactly how easily a good person could be trapped by a bad debt and a worse man. Thank you for telling me, Isolde said simply. That took more courage than you know. She spent the following 2 days doing what 5 years of grief and 1 week of careful investigation had prepared her for. Building a trap of her own, layered carefully inside the trap Aldrich believed he was setting for her. The plan, when it finally assembled itself in full, was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its risk. Aldrich intended to lure her to the reservoir grounds under cover of charity and eliminate her there, likely Kale surmised from the pattern of Vask's alchemical purchases. Using a smaller and more targeted dose of the same compound that would one day poison the entire lower city framed afterward as a tragic accident during her own inspection of the water system. It was, Isolde realized with a cold, distant horror, almost certainly a dress rehearsal. Aldrich intended to test the compound's lethality on her alone before deploying it at scale against the city. So she would give him exactly the moment he was waiting for, and fill it, invisibly, with every piece of evidence they had gathered. Kale arranged for 2 of the household guards he trusted absolutely, men who had served with him on the northern border, and who had lost friends to the same accidental, blighted well that first made him start asking questions, to be stationed at the reservoir under the guise of standard security for a noble visit. With instructions to watch not Isolde but Vask, and to intervene the instant any compound was introduced to the water. Cashin meanwhile used his authority as crown prince to quietly request that a treasury auditor, a woman named Myril Cass, notorious throughout the court for an integrity so absolute it had cost her 3 promotions, accompany the inspection party to review flood control budget allocations, a request Aldrich could not refuse without arousing suspicion he had spent 8 months carefully avoiding. Rena's role was the most dangerous and she volunteered for it before anyone asked. He trusts me, she said, quiet and steady in a way Isolde had never seen from her before. He thinks I'm too frightened to ever turn on him. Let him keep thinking that until it's too late to matter. The morning of the inspection arrived gray and overcast, mist clinging low to the reservoir's stone embankments like something reluctant to witness what was about to happen. Isolde stood at the edge of the water in a charcoal traveling coat, watching Lord Dorian Vask approach with a leather satchel of purification samples, and a smile so pleasant it made her skin crawl and reminded herself. With the particular discipline of a woman who had already died once, and refused to make the same mistake twice, that fear was useful only when it sharpened her attention, and never when it slowed her hands. Lady Isolde, Vask said warmly, setting his satchel down on the embankment wall with deliberate care. How generous of you to take such an interest in the Crown's water infrastructure. Shall I show you how the purification testing works? I think you'll find it, his smile widened just slightly, in a way that made the mist around them feel suddenly colder, quite illuminating. Behind him, unseen, Duke Aldrich Orlane watched from a carriage at the top of the embankment road, entirely confident that within the hour, the girl who had become inconveniently curious about his 8-month-old plan would be nothing more than a tragic footnote in an official reservoir accident report. He did not yet know that Myril Cass, standing quietly at the edge of the inspection party with a ledger and an auditor's unbothered patience, had already begun cataloging every irregular detail of Vask's purification samples for a report that would reach the king's own desk within the week. He did not know that 2 guards loyal to Kale Draven stood, positioned exactly close enough to intervene the moment poison touched water. He did not know that Rena Halstead standing at Isolde's side with her hands folded and her face carefully composed, had spent the previous night memorizing every word Vask had ever said to her about the true nature of their arrangement, ready to testify against him the instant it would matter most. And he did not know. As Vask opened his satchel and reached for a small glass vial that caught the gray morning light like something patient and hungry, that Isolde Verren had already died once, believing herself utterly alone in the world, and had built in the 5 short weeks since her return. An alliance of exactly the people Aldrich had always assumed too weak, too frightened, or too loyal to ever turn against him. Before we begin, Isolde said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the misted water, loud enough for every member of the inspection party to hear. I think it's only fair to tell you, Lord Vask, that I already know precisely what's in that vial, and precisely who commissioned you to make it. The vial slipped just slightly in Vask's suddenly unsteady grip. For one long, suspended moment, no one at the reservoir's edge moved at all. Vask's composure, which had survived 8 months of careful conspiracy without a single visible crack, finally began to splinter in real time, his eyes flicking toward the carriage at the top of the embankment road. Toward the man who had promised him this would be simple, toward the two guards who had begun very deliberately to close the distance between themselves and his satchel. "I don't know what you're implying, Lady Isolde," he said, but the pleasant warmth had gone out of his voice entirely, replaced by something thinner and more brittle. "This is a standard water purification test, conducted under the Crown Treasury's own authority." "Under Duke Aldrich's authority," Isolde corrected, and watched something flicker across Vask's face at the sound of his patron's name spoken so plainly in front of witnesses in the open air. "The same authority that commissioned an alchemical compound 8 months ago disguised as purification chalk. The same authority that used a falsified name, T-Marrow, to move that compound past inspection at this very reservoir 6 weeks ago in a smaller test batch. The same authority," she continued, her voice rising just enough to carry to the carriage at the top of the road, "that has spent the last week deciding I've become too dangerous to leave breathing, and arranged this morning's charitable inspection as the setting for my accidental death." "That's an extraordinary accusation to make with no proof," Vask said, but his hand, Isolde noted with cold satisfaction, had gone very still around the vial, no longer moving toward the water at all. "I have the original contract in your own hand, hidden in the Halstead family archive," Isolde said. "I have the falsified requisition record for the reservoir shipment 6 weeks ago. I have a Treasury auditor standing 3 feet from you right now, cataloging every detail of this test for a report that will reach the King's desk by week's end." She paused, letting the words land, letting Vask's eyes dart once more helplessly toward the carriage that had not moved. "And I have Lady Rena Halstead, who has spent 8 months documenting every threat Duke Aldrich made against her family to secure her cooperation. Threats I imagine a magistrate would find quite illuminating, given how closely they mirror the threats made against Captain Draven's own family this past month." Rena stepped forward then, her hands no longer shaking, her voice steady in a way that made Isolde's chest ache with something like pride. "I have every letter," she said. "Every meeting, every threat, written down and given to a solicitor outside the capital 3 days ago, with instructions to release them to the Crown's magistrates if anything happened to either of us before the month was out." She looked at Vask, and something in her expression had hardened past fear into a resolve Isolde had never once seen from her in either life. "You told me it was only a delayed shipment, Lord Vask. You told me nothing that would hurt anyone. I believed you because I wanted to. I don't intend to make that mistake a second time." Up on the embankment road, the carriage door finally opened, and Duke Aldrich Orlane stepped out into the gray morning light with the unhurried calm of a man who still, even now, believed he held every card in this game. "Lady Isolde," he called down, his voice carrying easily across the water, warm and avuncular in exactly the way Isolde remembered from a life she had spent 5 years trying to forget. "I think perhaps you've let your imagination run rather further than the evidence supports. Lord Vask is a respected court alchemist conducting routine testing under my authority. Whatever paperwork you believe you found, I assure you, has a far more mundane explanation than the one you've constructed." "Then you won't mind explaining it to my nephew," came a second voice, steady, familiar, arriving from the direction of the embankment path that led back toward the palace. And Cashin emerged from the mist with Myril Cass's completed preliminary report already in hand, his expression carrying none of the easy golden warmth Isolde had once loved so simply. And all of the cold, careful authority of a crown prince who had spent 9 days quietly preparing for exactly this confrontation. "I've read Auditor Cass's findings, Uncle. I've cross-referenced the reservoir shipment records myself. And I've spoken to 3 witnesses in the border garrison town under your regional treasury office's jurisdiction, all of whom confirm receiving anonymous threats against their families within the last month. Threats that stopped the instant I began asking questions with the full weight of the crown behind them." For the first time since Isolde had woken in her 17-year-old body with 5 years of grief folded into her hands, she watched Duke Aldrich Orlane's composure crack entirely. "Cashin," he said, and his voice had lost its warmth, gone instead sharp and urgent, "you don't understand the position this family is in. Your father's health is failing faster than the court knows. If this girl's family retains influence over your claim to the throne through this betrothal, and her line proves as troublesome and independent-minded as she's shown herself to be this past month, this empire's succession will be weakened for a generation. Everything I've done to secure your throne. By poisoning 3,000 people," Isolde said, and the words landed across the misted water like a blade. That was always the plan, wasn't it? Not just my death today. The lower city reservoir, 6 weeks from now, at scale. Enough devastation that the crown would need someone strong and blameless to rally the empire through the crisis. Someone like Cashin, freshly free of a betrothal that had become a liability, untouched by the disaster because the evidence would already point toward a grieving, jealous noblewoman with a broken engagement, and a motive everyone would find easy to believe. The silence that followed confirmed what Isolde had already known in her bones since the moment she'd woken in her childhood bed, with 5 years of another woman's execution folded into her memory. Duke Aldrich Orlane had not simply used her death as one small piece of a larger scheme. He had built the entire architecture of the Ashfall Blight around the specific, devastating purpose of destroying her, because a prince freed by tragedy from an inconvenient betrothal made for a far more sympathetic, far more controllable heir than a prince who had simply changed his mind. "You were never going to stop at me," she said quietly, and for the first time since her second life began, she let the full weight of 5 years of grief show plainly on her face, not for herself this time, but for 3,041 names that in this life she had arrived just in time to save. "You were going to drown an entire city to make certain of it." Duke Aldrich's hand moved fast and sudden, toward something concealed beneath his coat. And in the same instant, Kale's 2 guards closed the final distance to Vask's satchel, seizing both the alchemist and the vial before it could be dropped, thrown, or used as one final desperate act of destruction. Cashin stepped forward, placing himself without hesitation directly between his uncle and the woman he had once sworn, in another life, in a wedding that would never now take place under these circumstances, to protect above all else. "It's over, Uncle," Cashin said, and his voice, though quiet, carried the unmistakable weight of a man who had finally fully chosen. "Guards, take him into custody on the authority of the Crown Prince, pending formal charges of conspiracy, attempted murder, and treason against the throne." Duke Aldrich Orlane's hand fell still. For one final terrible moment, he looked at Isolde across the misted water with an expression she recognized instantly, because she had worn it herself once in another life, standing on a platform of black stone with snow falling into her hair. The particular hollow shock of someone realizing far too late that the story had not gone the way they'd been so certain it would. "You were supposed to die quietly," he said, almost to himself, as the guards closed around him. 5 years from now, no one was ever supposed to know how carefully any of this was built. 5 years from now, I already did die exactly the way you intended," Isolde said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that saying it aloud no longer hurt the way she had expected it to. "I simply decided not to stay that way." The trial of Duke Aldrich Orlane and Lord Dorian Vask lasted 11 days, and unlike the trial that had once taken Isolde's life in a single grey morning, this one unfolded in the full, unflinching light of every piece of evidence 5 weeks of careful, dangerous work had assembled. Vask's original contract, the falsified shipment records, Myril, Cass's meticulous audit of the reservoir testing, Rena's documented account of 8 months of threats, and most damning of all, the testimony of 3 families in the border garrison town who had lived under quiet, patient intimidation for a month before Cashin's investigation had finally given them the courage to speak. Isolde sat in the gallery for every day of it, not in the dock this time, not in a mourning-colored gown chosen by someone else, but in a seat of her own choosing, beside a cousin who had finally stopped flinching every time a guard's footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, and a knight who had stopped sometime in the last 5 weeks, standing quite so carefully apart from her as protocol technically required. When the magistrate finally read the verdict, treason, conspiracy, and attempted mass murder for both men, with sentencing left to the king's own discretion, given the unprecedented scale of what had nearly been unleashed on the lower city, Isolde felt something in her chest finally fully unclench for the first time since she had watched a headsman's blade catch the morning light in a life that in this telling would now never come to pass. She did not feel triumphant, exactly. 5 years of grief had taught her that revenge, even earned and even just, rarely tasted the way you expected it to when you finally held it in your hands. What she felt instead was something quieter and more durable, the particular hard-won piece of a woman who had gone back into the fire, a second time, not for vengeance alone, but to make certain 3,041 people who had never known her name would live to grow old in a city she had once in grief and rage believed she had failed entirely. Duke Aldrich Orlane was stripped of his titles and his regency, and sentenced to life imprisonment in the northern fortress of Caro, hold his vast treasury holdings seized and redirected at Cashin's insistence toward rebuilding the lower city's aging flood infrastructure so thoroughly that no reservoir in the empire would ever again be vulnerable to the kind of quiet, patient poisoning he had spent 8 months perfecting. Lord Dorian Vask, whose testimony against his patron in exchange for a lighter sentence ultimately confirmed every detail of the conspiracy, was stripped of his alchemical license and exiled beyond the Empire's borders, forbidden ever to practice his craft again on pain of death. Rena Halstead, whose 8 months of forced complicity had ended in the very testimony that broke the conspiracy wide open, received the king's formal pardon. Not because her mistake had been small, Isolde made certain to say plainly and publicly in a statement read before the full court, but because a person coerced by threat and debt into a single act of fear deserved the chance to become through courage something far better than the worst thing she had ever been forced to do. Rena wept that evening in a way Isolde had never once seen from her in either life, not the polished tears of court performance, but the raw, exhausted relief of a woman finally, fully forgiven by the one person she had feared losing most. "I don't deserve it," Rena said, still crying in the quiet of Isolde's chambers that night. "Maybe not," Isolde said gently, taking her cousin's hands in both of her own. "But I've learned the hard way that the Empire is very good at deciding who deserves forgiveness and very bad at ever actually offering it. I'd rather be better than the Empire, Rena, wouldn't you?" Cassian, for his part, did not immediately ask her to renew their betrothal, and Isolde found, turning the question over in the quiet weeks that followed the trial, that she was in no particular hurry for him to. She had loved him once, in a life that had ended badly enough that love alone no longer felt like sufficient reason to build a future on. What she found instead in the aftermath of everything was something more honest, a genuine respect for the man who had chosen to believe her over his own beloved uncle at real and devastating personal cost, and a quiet gratitude that did not require the shape of a crown to feel complete. "I think," she told him, on a gray afternoon much like the one at the reservoir, though this time the mist felt merely like weather instead of omen, "that we make better allies than we ever made lovers, Cassian. I hope that doesn't wound you too badly." He smiled, the first fully easy smile she'd seen from him since the trial began, and said, "Honestly, Isolde, I think some part of me has known that since the reservoir. You were never quite looking at me the way a woman looks at the man she means to marry. You were looking at me the way a general looks at an ally she needs to trust completely." He paused. "I'd rather have that than the crown, if I'm honest. I think I always would have, eventually. You simply gave me 5 weeks instead of 5 years to work it out." It was Cale who found her that evening in the same garden where Rena had once tested her with a question sharp enough to cut. Sitting on the same stone bench beneath a sky finally fully clear of the mist that had followed her through every dangerous morning of the past 5 weeks. "You're not betrothed to the crown prince anymore," he said, sitting beside her with the careful, deliberate space of a man who had spent 6 years, across 2 entire lifetimes now, though only he and she would ever know it, teaching himself not to want the thing standing directly in front of him. "No," Isolde agreed, "I'm not. I wanted to tell you something," Cale said, "that I never had the chance to say in whatever version of this life ended with you on that platform. I don't know if it would have changed anything. I don't know if it's even mine to say now, given everything you've survived to make certain none of that ever happens." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time since the archive, since the night he had said "I believe you" without a single moment's hesitation, she saw him let his guard down entirely. "I have loved you, I think. Since the winter you were 19 and insisted on learning to fight with a blade half your own weight, rather than let anyone else defend you. And I have never once in 5 weeks or 5 years found a version of loving you that made me want to stop." Isolde looked at him, this steady, silent, endlessly careful man who had once stood mute in a courtroom. While she died not from cowardice, she now understood completely. But because someone had built a trap cruel enough to silence even the most loyal heart she had ever known, and felt the last locked door in her chest swing quietly finally open. "I died once," she said, "believing I had been abandoned by everyone I loved. I came back determined never to trust so easily again, never to hand my whole heart to anyone who hadn't first proven under real pressure that they deserved it." She reached for his hand and did not let go. "You have spent 5 weeks proving exactly that, Cale Draven, every single day without once asking me to notice. I noticed anyway." Above them, the last of the mist finally cleared from the capital's sky and somewhere across the city. In the lower district, that would now never know the particular grief of the Ashfall Blight, 3,041 people who would never learn how close they had come to dying, went on quietly living their unremarkable, uninterrupted lives, never knowing that a woman who had once been executed for their deaths had instead spent her second chance making absolutely certain they would never have to be mourned at all. That Isolde thought. settling against Kale's shoulder as the first stars came out over a city she had saved twice now. Once by dying without understanding why, and once by refusing to let that death mean anything at all, was the only kind of justice that had ever truly mattered. Not the satisfaction of watching her enemies fall, though there was some quiet peace in that too. But this, a city that would wake up tomorrow, and the day after, and every ordinary day thereafter, entirely unaware of the catastrophe it had been spared, simply because one woman had refused to let her own death be the end of her story.